I brought up a lot of the criticism, as you mentioned, a lot of the concerns about it. But still, that piece was the most controversial piece I've ever written in my life because so many people were like, oh, he fell for the hype. He doesn't realize that these things are just stochastic parrots and autocomplete on steroids, and he thinks that they're actually.
I see. So that's the kind of response you got from
I mean, a lot of people loved it. It was. I had wonderful. I was very proud of that piece, and I think it has held up well since then. But it was absolutely unpleasant to go through like the week or two after it because I was just getting like pilloried on Twitter and social media about it.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. I'm Nick Dirks. I'm the president of the New York Academy of Sciences, and for this episode, I'm joined by Stephen Johnson. Stephen Johnson is a best-selling author whose work explores the history of innovation, the evolution of complex systems, and the intersection of science, technology, and society. He is the author of more than a dozen acclaimed books, including Everything Bad is Good for You and Where Good Ideas Come From. He's also the host of the Emmy-winning PBS BBC series, How We Got to Now. His interdisciplinary writing has illuminated how scientific breakthroughs emerge, how ideas spread, and how technology transforms human life. Stephen is currently the Editorial Director at Google Labs, where he helped develop the new AI-powered writing and research tool, NotebookLM, about which we'll be talking soon. But thank you, Stephen. Really great to have you with us here for Shaping Science.
Thanks, Nick. Great to be here.
So I'd like to begin by going back a little bit.
Yeah.
You majored in semiotics as an undergraduate. You went to my old university, Columbia, to begin a PhD in comparative literature, as I see from your CV.
English, I think it was
English and comparative literature. It would be,
yeah, exactly.
And at some point, you decided to leave and become a best-selling author. I'm sure there are a few steps in between, but you not only began writing books, or at least began soon thereafter writing books. You wrote your first book, as I have it here, and I may be wrong, you can correct me, but in 1997, a book called Interface Culture, How New Technology Transforms the Way We Create and Communicate, which I take to be in some ways both an indication that you were way ahead of the curve in thinking about technology, but also that you had an interest from the very beginning in the intersection and relationship between science, technology on the one side and culture, literature, the arts on the other. But fill in the blanks in the story that of your early life.
It was kind of a lonely space to be, actually, in the early 90s. It's funny to look back at it. So most of my friends and peers were humanities people, and they were, very interested in creative work. A bunch of them went on to become novelists. And there was not very much talk about technology in that world. This is the point at which, Wired magazine had not come out yet. And so if you were interested in computers, there was really no cultural space for you in a way. Like you could, if you were like, I want to write about computers. It's like, so you want to review the latest version of Microsoft Excel for PC magazine? Like, what are you talking about? Like, what is there to do?
Yeah, especially in New York, right? You're not in, in Silicon Valley at this point.
There's an alt timeline where I actually applied to the History of Consciousness program at Santa Cruz, which was also And if I really wanted to be in New York, but if I'd gone there and been like just over the ridge from Silicon Valley in the 90s, I don't know what would have happened. It would have been a different story. But I had always, since I was really kind of like a creature of the Mac. Like I got a Mac when I arrived at Brown in '86, and kind of just fell in love with it. It was the first computer that felt like a creative person could really spend some time with it. Like it had typography. Like that was really amazing as a writer. and something about the white screen with black text, which was new, felt like, oh, this is like paper. I can actually like
So
look
you were a
at my
Mac
work.
person from the beginning.
So I was a Mac person from the beginning, and got really obsessed in sophomore year with this program called HyperCard that has a direct connection to what I ended up doing a million years later with NotebookLM. So, by the time I was in grad school in the early 90s, I kind of had this dual existence where, by day I was reading, Bleak House and Middlemarch and kind of living in this 19th century world. And by night I would go home and was getting on like the early online communities like the Well and Echo, and CompuServe. The web really hadn't happened at that point. And was interested in computer games and was interested in design on computers. And I kind of, it felt like a split existence where I really didn't, there were just two worlds that I was occupying. And I remember being up on the Columbia campus on 116th and Broadway. They used to have those old newsstands there. I don't even know if they still have those. And I remember seeing Wired magazine for the first time. And it was people writing about technology as a cultural force and not just product reviews and productivity guides and things like that. And I just was like, oh, these are my people. Like, who are these people? And I was like, oh, they all seem to live in San Francisco. Like I'm missing my my crowd. And that was the first hint of a way of kind of publicly writing about tech and its impact that kind of planted the seed in my mind that I could actually do something in that mode. And then the other big thing that really pulled me out of actually finishing the PhD was I got on the web in 1994, early 1994, which was a couple of years before it really became a mainstream thing. And I learned how to write HTML, which was not that
that's what I was going to
complicated.
ask you, if you were doing coding.
I wasn't really
yourself.
doing coding, but the most advanced coding I've done is like HTML, which is not really coding, but at the time I guess it was relatively sophisticated. And it occurred to me, I think in part because of this semiotics background and because I've been thinking about textuality and nonlinear textual forms and things like that. And there was kind of a hypertext fiction community at Brown when I was there. So I'd been thinking about like nonlinear narrative structures that you could tell with hypertext. And so when the web was kind of presented to me as, hey, here's this potential interface for the internet that's open and global and built around a kind of an interesting, almost post-structuralist textual metaphor of links between pages, I was just prepared to get it. Like I saw it and was like, this is the future.
So interesting.
And then I basically was like, hey, I could actually start a magazine on the web, and this is crazy, people, but if you just publish it on the web, anyone around the world with a web browser will be able to read it. Like this was a really novel idea that you could just publish it once and everybody could get to it. And I had a bunch of friends in New York who were kind of early stages of their journalistic career, and a friend, Stephanie Simon, who I'd met through kind of mutual friends, who was writing about tech for the Wall Street Journal. And Stephanie and I were like, why don't we just start a magazine? And so we started this thing called Feed, which was the first online only web magazine in the the history of the web, and before Slate and Salon and all those other ones that came later. And
what year was this?
1995, early 1995.
And what was Feed featuring articles about?
Yeah, we did a lot. We were trying to position ourselves kind of as the East Coast Wired with a little bit, a kind of a fusion of Wired and the New Yorker, I guess I would say. So we covered things that weren't tech related, and we were trying to be less utopian than Wired. So we were like, we're more pragmatic, and we have more of a
you were in New York.
We were in New York. We had the more jaded, kind of sophisticated take on technology, but we were obviously enthusiasts as well. And we published a lot of folks early in their career who went on to Catherine Schultz and Keith Gesson and Clay Shirky, and like all these people like published first at Feed. Josh Marshall, like amazing cohort of people who first appeared at Feed. And so I basically had this point. I'd finished my orals and was starting to work on my dissertation.
Which was going to be on?
Which was going to be on kind of the 19th century novel and industrialization in the metropolis in some form. I was just starting to kind of piece it together. And so technology in the novel in some way. And I kind of looked around and was like, oh, it's 1995, and I seem to have accidentally created an internet startup, a web-based startup in 1995. Like, I could keep doing this, or I could continue with my PhD. And I just decided I was like, well, I'll pause the PhD for a while, and I'll do feed. And then I sold that first book, Interface Culture, about how the ways we represent things on our screens were going to become increasingly important to society on a whole host of levels. I sold that first book based on kind of my experience doing feed, and then by that point, after that came out, I became a full-time writer.
So that was book number one.
Yeah.
And it was about, obviously called Interface Culture, but it was about the screen and how it was going to transform culture, broadly speaking, or everyday social life, or how did you?
Yeah, there was a direct connection to the dissertation that I didn't write, in that, I'd been very interested in the way in which Dickens had, particularly of all the 19th century novelists, was trying to create a kind of a creative narrative form that could explain or make sense of this incredible new reality of the metropolis, and that London had gone through this period of unbelievable, unprecedented growth, was the largest city in the world, the largest city the world had ever seen. Industrialization was happening. So people were living through this like extraordinary change, generation to generation, in like what their actual experience was and the kinds of communities they were living in. And so, books like Bleak House and Little Dorrit were an attempt to kind of figure out what is the right narrative structure to explain this new reality to people and make it kind of legible to them in this way. And so what I was arguing in Interface Culture was, in our age, the thing that exceeds our ability to imagine or to make sense of it without help is the information space, right? There's suddenly all this information, just as the city was unimaginably larger than anybody had ever experienced before as a lived community. So now we have this internet, which is so much bigger than any one person can kind of take in. And so we need sense makers, and we need tools to help us figure out what is the information we need and put it in front of us and map this like extraordinary new virtual territory. And so in that book, I was saying there's a word for this. We call this interface design. Like this is the people who control the way we visualize and interact with information are going to become incredibly important in society, because everything is going to be funneled through the metaphors they come up with and the way that they structure that information for us. And so we need to understand what this new, both kind of creative form is and also commercial form of shaping these computer interfaces. So it sold the least of any of the books. I think it's the only one that's out of print now. But it
definitely needs to be brought back into print, and certainly we can talk about whether Notebook could release it again. But nevertheless, in a way, it was ahead of its time.
Yeah.
One of the books I remember from the 90s as being a really important book, not just in my own academic work, but and I taught it a lot and so on. But it was a way of thinking about the emergence of nationalism, but around technologies of communication. It was Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities, right?
Yeah.
And he begins with this kind of image of a world that is created in a city in particular by the fact that everybody gets the same newspaper every morning. It's the same kind of intermediation of one's experience of the world, and indeed even of living in a particular place, that makes a large city possible as the basis for community formation.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the people reading and teaching that book, like me, didn't go on to think about the next stage of technology. And, I think there was, at that point, there were very few people in the academic world who were actually doing the kind of thinking that you were obviously doing to imagine what and how a new kind of community could be forged by the new internet. But again, I mean, you might well have been sort of, ahead of your time, and which is why the book, nobody quite knew what to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, looking back on it, it was, I was trying to figure out a way to write in a more popular mode and stripping some of the more academic framings that I had been up until that point pretty much working within. And I kind of got halfway there with that book. Even the fact that it was called Interface Culture was kind of wasn't the greatest title looking back on it. It's more of an academic kind of title. And I think I didn't fully figure out that kind of intellectual but popular voice that I've tried to use since then until Emergence, the second book.
Yeah, so the second book, Emergence, comes out in 2001.
Comes out on 9/11, literally on the pub date was September 11th, 2001.
All right. Well, that probably disrupted some of the plans that you had to do your book tour.
Yes, it did. It was interesting because Emergence is about self-organizing systems and decentralized systems and networks, and so it turned out to be weirdly relevant to Al-Qaeda in particular. Like all of a sudden, we were at war with a network that was not a traditional kind of command military or state, and so there were lots of ways in which I ended up talking about what happened on 9/11 in the context of Emergence, but the subtitle of the book was The Connected Lives of Ants, Brains, Cities, and Software, which didn't necessarily suggest right out of the gate that it was like relevant to the war on terror and all that.
No, but nevertheless, it was following up on some of the kinds of themes that you had already begun Interface Culture with, and I take it that you were already beginning to read complexity theory, which was being used to both, think about the natural world, but also the human world in terms of even cities and urban development and so on and so forth. But you do Emergence, and then you keep publishing books on a fairly constant pace every 2-3 years.
Yep.
And the books begin to sell, and I'm presuming you could make a living by writing books, which is not something
a really lucky thing. Yeah, it's very fun. Yeah, I had long stretches where I was just a writer and a speaker. I started doing more kind of public speaking, but where I, as my father still likes to say, where I never really had a real job.
Well, those of us who have written know that it may not look real, but boy, oh boy, it's real work. But in each one of the books, you take on a slightly different angle around relationships between science and technology and social change. And you have very extraordinary insights about the role that technology can play. Technologies of understanding, that we live in a world of oxygen and air, or technologies of refrigeration and cold, or a variety of others, which I'll ask you to say a little bit about. But in each case, you are clear that it's not the science or the technology alone. It has to both connect in a way with the world outside of the laboratory. But then it, has to connect to human events, human history, and you've kind of gone back and forth between somebody who focuses on a trajectory around technological change, development, discovery, and the like, but somebody who is, fundamentally committed to the role that that both idiosyncrasy, serendipity, on the one side, but also social change, social process, social history plays on the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because you can look at the books and kind of say, this guy is very easily distracted with, I wrote about cholera, and then I wrote about video games, and then I wrote about neuroscience, and then I wrote about oxygen in the 18th century, and then I wrote, but I think there are kind of two themes that are pretty consistent through all of them, which you kind of touched on there, one of which is just this question of when there are truly disruptive, truly world-changing ideas that come out of science or come out of technology or come out of the creative arts. How does that happen? Like, what are there underlying patterns that we can see if you look in the kind of long view of history that keep recurring when transformative ideas come into being. And so, I'd always been interested in that, the mystery of like the phase transition where like there wasn't this idea, no one was interested in electricity, then everybody was interested. No one was trying to build a light bulb, then everybody was trying to build a light bulb. And so, particularly that stretch in the second half of the aughts, or whatever we call that decade, where it did Ghost Map and then Invention of Air and then Where Good Ideas Come From. Those are 3 books that are kind of like, the first 2 are kind of case studies in transformative revolutionary ideas and really trying to like zoom in on what were the forces that made them possible. And so that's one theme. And the other one which is kind of, in a sense, what happens downstream of those innovations. So once this transformative new ideas in the world, it ends up having these unlikely, serendipitous or hard to predict secondary effects that kind of trickle out into society. And one of the reasons I've always been drawn to those is they just make for great stories. Like people tend to like to hear. So like that's what we did a lot of and how we got to now is, you invent books and then it turns out everybody realizes who's over 40 that they can't actually like read the books. And so that spawns this whole new market for spectacles so that people can read, which then creates a whole subculture of lens makers who then develop these skills that enable them to actually make telescopes and microscopes, which basically spawns a whole new revolution in our understanding of the universe and our understanding of life.
So the book leads directly or indirectly, as the case may be, to both microscopes and telescopes.
Yeah, everybody thinks that the book is leading to the scientific revolution because the ideas were published in the books, which is true. That's part of it. But there's this other side of which is the books made it clear to people they needed glasses because you just didn't have a lot of things, unless you were like a seamstress or something. There weren't a lot of reasons to look at very small things. And if you were, what's a technical term for not being able to, I've forgotten the like actual term for that kind of farsightedness or whatever. So it exposed this flaw in the human eye. That had been just kind of hidden before the invention of books, and that indirectly leads to microscopes and telescopes, another part of the scientific revolution.
Yeah, no, fascinating story. You also, of course, and you just mentioned this too, but you got interested in the question of disease and how that both can bring a society to its knees, but also how it creates, the need for scientists to try to do something very quickly to figure out what's causing this disease. I mean, you talked about the cholera epidemic in London in the 19th century. And we recently had on this podcast Laura Spinney, whose first book was on the Spanish flu, and then she went on to talk about the origin of language. And so she's also hopped around and done different things. But as you began to come back to some of the kinds of questions around technology and the like, at what point did you begin to come back to the digital age as a kind of not only subject that you were interested in, but as something more than just a vehicle for either publication or a journal or whatever? Because there has to be a story here now connecting this this history of writing, these wonderful books and your recruitment to Google.
Yeah, where I finally got a real job.
Where you went into the, but you also where you went into the belly of the.
Yeah. So I was always an early adopter of tools for writing and research from the beginning. I mean, I was, if there was some new note-taking tool, I was using it. I was a huge evangelist for this tool around the same period when I was writing Ghost Map. It was called DevonThink, which was a kind of a note-taking tool that had almost a proto-language model-like ability to sense connections between paragraphs of text. That were, even if they didn't have any words in common, it could sense kind of semantic connections. And so I started collecting all my notes and all the quotations from books that I'd read as part of my research. I would create digital copies so that I could search them and then use them in this database, DevonThink, when I was writing. So I was always interested in what was out there in terms of the tools. I was a big user of Scrivener, which is an amazing word processor and I would write about the tools that I was using. So Where Good Ideas Come From has a whole section about DevonThink. It talks about how you can use software to augment your creativity or make new connections for you. So it's just always there. And then I did a couple of other startups beyond Feed. I did a kind of like hyperlocal news thing called Outside In, which we sold to AOL during this period. I started a kind of a proto version of what became NotebookLM called Findings in 2011, 2012 that just never really took off, but was also a kind of a note-taking tool. So I was always dabbling in creating things and creating technology as well as writing about it, and would kind of bounce back and forth. So I think by the time language models really started to appear on the scene, again, it was a lot like the web. Like I was primed to see the potential.
We'll be right back after a short break.
Hi, I'm Jacob Goldstein. I'm the host of What's Your Problem, a podcast about the problems that really smart people are trying to solve right now. Every week on What's Your Problem, entrepreneurs and engineers describe the future they're going to build once they solve a few problems. I'm talking to people trying to figure out how to do things that no one else on the planet knows how to do. From building a plane that produces zero carbon emissions to building an AI model that can predict human health. Listen to What's Your Problem on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, you wrote a piece in the New York Times Sunday magazine in the spring of 2022.
Which is kind of how we first met, was after that piece had come out, right?
And I read it and I thought, this is interesting. You obviously focused on OpenAI, but you raised some questions about LLMs, and you raised questions really having to do with some of the kinds of worries that, of course, now we know much more about, but having to do with, was there a kind of ethical compass for these kinds of breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the like, and who was going to provide, the ethical and social oversight for the people who were like Sam Altman, who's featured there, in the technology companies that were obviously going to benefit from having monopolies over the production of these new extraordinary technological tools. So we connected after that because I was so fascinated by the piece, but I had no idea that a few weeks later you'd get a call and you'd disappear into Google.
So that whole piece was it was a fascinating adventure. It kind of changed my life in a way. So the funny backstory of the piece was that I had seen a talk by Greg Brockman, who is the kind of second in command at OpenAI, in the summer of 2021. And in that talk, he discussed how OpenAI had this unusual hybrid organizational structure where they were kind of a nonprofit, but they were kind of also becoming a for-profit. And at that point, OpenAI had announced and was kind of privately sharing GPT-3, which is the model before ChatGPT. And you couldn't kind of directly get access to it, but if you kind of worked at it, you could get access to it. And some people had written about it a little bit. And so I went back to the Times Magazine and I said, hey, I want to write a piece. People have already written about this GPT-3 thing, and people understand that it's interesting, but nobody's written about this weird org structure that they have with, for-profit and nonprofit, which turned out to be hugely important when they eventually had their huge crack up. That it's it's created this fissure in the company that they're still kind of recovering from in a weird way. So I pitched the Times and I was like, I just want to write about this weird new hybrid structure they have because it's kind of interesting. And I'll mention the language model stuff. And they said, okay, that sounds great. So then I got in order to report the piece, they gave me access to GPT-3 so that I could mess around with it. And I just remember it was like October of 2021 and I'm in my study in Brooklyn and I get access to it and I start playing around with it and I'm there for like 3 hours. And I'm just like, oh, this is so much more important than anybody has written about yet. Like, this is so much more important than the stupid, like, nonprofit, for-profit structure. Like, this is the single most important thing that has happened in technology in my lifetime. And it's going to change the way we use computers. It's going to open up a whole host of problems. And so I went back to the Times and said, forget what I told you before. I'm just writing about, like, what it means when computers have mastered language. Like, that is a fundamental change. And I'll mention the org structure, but it's mostly going to be about language models. And then I wrote a 10,000 word piece, which is very long for the Times Magazine, basically wrestling with that question. And it was, I brought up a lot of the criticism, as you mentioned, a lot of the concerns about it. But still, that piece was the most controversial piece I've ever written in my life, because so many people were like, oh, he fell for the hype. He doesn't realize that these things are just stochastic parrots and autocomplete on steroids, and he thinks that they're actually.
I see. So that's the kind of response you got from.
I mean, a lot of people loved it. It was. I had wonderful. I was very proud of that piece, and I think it has held up well since then. But it was absolutely unpleasant to go through, like, the week or two after it, because I was just getting, like, pilloried on Twitter and social media about it. But there were some folks at Google who had just started up a division called Google Labs, who had been reading my work over the years and had read and been influenced by where good ideas come from and the way they were thinking about how Labs was going to work at Google. And they read that piece, and one of them is this guy, Clay Bavor, who's since left, turned to the other, Josh Woodward, who's runs Labs now and also runs the Gemini app now.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic guy. And Clay said to Josh, apparently, hey, did you see Steven's piece? Like, maybe we could get him to come and do, like, a motivational speech about what we're doing here. And Josh was like, what if we asked him to come and actually to build something? Because he's obsessed with, like, research tools and things like that. And so they cold called me out of the blue and said, hey, you don't know us, but what would you think if we gave you a couple of, like, an engineer and a designer and a prototyper, and you could have access to our language models, and you could just come and, like, build something, because you've been chasing this dream writing and research tool idea since you were in college. Like, maybe we could do something together. Would that interest you? And I was like, yes, it would. And I honestly thought we would build some cool prototypes, and I would get access to this technology, which I was interested in, and I would meet some really interesting people. But I figured Google must have, like, 1,000 prototypes going at any given moment, and the likelihood that it would actually see the light of day was pretty slim. But it still seemed like a fun adventure. And so I joined it. We built a little prototype in the fall of 2022. Again, this is pre-ChatGPT. And it just kind of took off internally a little bit. I think it was us trying to really, like, build something new on top of AI that was not just adding AI to a word processor or adding AI to a spreadsheet, but trying to, like, think about how you would build an application from the ground up, knowing that there was going to be a language model central to everything you were doing. And so in a way, it was back to interface culture. It was like, okay, now we have to come up with a completely new interface with this radically new technology. And so by the time, it became clear that this was a big priority for the company post ChatGPT, and we were one of the projects that actually had pushed the boundaries kind of the furthest.
So it's November 2022. OpenAI releases ChatGPT. It takes the world by storm. I don't know if you were surprised, but there were a lot of people who were, because they hadn't had the kind of access you'd had to GPT. And it was, the rest, of course, is AI.
Yeah.
But as I understand it, Google at that point, and doubtless other companies as well, declare a kind of code red. And I'm aware that there were some people in Google X who were told, stop doing this. We're going to put all of our resources behind the development of LLMs. So you were positioned kind of centrally to this, and yet your primary kind of remit and interest was in developing what ultimately became NotebookLM.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about how you kept that focus, but also, obviously continued to develop a tool or a set of tools that simultaneously, uses the best of this new technology, but also, avoid some of the pitfalls of, just sort of, hoovering up stuff from the web and then producing, hyper-biased and problematic, hallucinatory, and sometimes, deeply disturbing output.
Well, the thing that we got very early in the Notebook project, it was codenamed Tailwind when it was first starting, was we had this idea that was very novel at the time. It's since become more commonplace, which was that you weren't going to just have a open-ended conversation with the model based on its general training data, but rather you were going to have what we started to call a source-grounded conversation with the model, which is to say you would give the model source material, documents, your notes, the PDF of the scientific paper you were trying to understand, and you would instruct the model to answer your questions or summarize if you asked for a summary based on the documents you'd given it. And you would restrict the model to that particular set of text or text. And that in the late summer of 2022, it was just basically there was no way to do that with any publicly facing model. And there was a project at Google when I arrived there that had this great name. It was called Talk to a Small Corpus. Not corpse, a corpus of text. And it was two engineers, this guy, Adam Bignell, is still on the team, who's fantastic. And it was trying to be what would happen if the model were given a text and you had to really ground it in that text and stick to the facts of that text. And I saw that and I was like, that's what I've always wanted. Because what if that were all the quotes from all the books that I've read or my research for the book that I'm writing, and I could just be like, hey, can you remind me when were bone flutes first discovered and what was the name of the country where that person, or just basic factual questions that I could ask with natural language queries and get, a paragraph of text explaining it. That just seemed amazing. And so we built Notebook around that from the very beginning. And it was in fact, to this day, in a way, you can't really use Notebook until you've uploaded source material. It doesn't really work. I think probably to a fault. We should make it a little bit easier to do something before you loaded source.
I was actually going to ask about that. I was going to ask if there was pushback both inside the company, but also from people you were interfacing with, to say, look, that's a whole lot of work I got to do at the beginning. For a historian, we do that work anyway. But many people who are, looking at a question or a subject or what have you, they don't know where to go in the first instance. And, the obvious advantage of an LLM is they can search a whole variety of things you don't even know exist out there in order to get the kinds of sources that you would then want perhaps to go in and delve in more deeply and read and use.
Yeah, it has definitely handicapped us over the years that it's been out, in the sense that the zero state is, as you say, you have to do a little bit of work, at least. You have to upload something, and then you can get results out of it. You
could use Gemini to, find what you need to upload, of course, I'm sure, but maybe not then in the beginning when you were doing this.
I think there was value in having that extra step because it was clearly the thing that differentiated us. And in some sense still differentiates us. You can now add documents to any, to ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude. But if you get beyond 2 or 3 or 4 documents, it really doesn't work very well. We can have in a single notebook, you can have 500 sources in a single notebook. And we have this whole architecture that continues to be kind of state of the art, which is very academic in a way, which is we have these citations that so every answer has inline citations from the model that point back to the exact passages in the source material that the model used to answer the question. And so when you get a nuanced, complex answer from Notebook that's drawing on information scattered across 100 different sources, and you can see these citations and click back to the exact passage that you were looking for in what could potentially be thousands and thousands of pages of information. Like that flow is something that was just like no computer in the world could do that 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
Right.
And we just have always kind of felt like that kind of source grounding approach and those citations is one of the reasons why it's been so widely adopted in schools. Is it just is an amazing kind of research tool. It turns out to have all these other uses as well. But but I think, yes, it has limited us in some cases that the first time user experience is challenging. And it's also a completely new interface. It doesn't look like any other tool you've ever quite used before because we were trying to do something new. And so that hurt us a little bit, but I don't know. It's worked out. We're growing at a crazy amount, and we've had some, we have no shortage of users now. So,
well, certainly from the point of view of schools and colleges and universities, this is wonderful because you immediately dispense with one of the major concerns about LLMs that that professors like me have.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think what is going to be interesting as you keep rolling this out is how you begin to see people learning that this is actually this can contribute to again trying to really get source material that is relevant and not upload a lot of the dribble that is on the internet, as people say, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
But are you finding that it's being picked up and used by people from well outside a kind of academic?
Yeah, fully. I mean, I would say certainly our biggest block of users are students or scholars, or researchers writ large.
Yeah.
And it clearly works for that. But there are all these other amazing use cases. So one of my favorites is it turns out to be a great platform for collecting the backstory or the lore of a fictional world. So one of our kind of early unexpected uses that we saw from the very beginning was Dungeons and Dragons players, like role-playing game players. Because basically, if you think about D&D, it's a very text-heavy game, right? You have people write these whole, almost like novels for the campaigns that they're running, and then as they're playing the game, they have to consult the story Bible, the encyclopedia of the world that they've created to figure out, what happens when they open that door and what happens when they attempt to kill that orc or whatever it is that they're doing in the game. And so the dungeon masters were loading up all their documents into Notebook, and then they could just very quickly be like, okay, what happens there? Or remind me what the name of that prince was. And so one of the things we're doing now in that realm is we've started publishing these collections of pre-curated notebooks. That's one of the big things I've been working on in the past year. We call them featured notebooks. And some of them we're doing with partners like The Economist and The Atlantic and things like that. But some of them are based on public domain information. And we just published the complete works of Jane Austen, including all the novels, her juvenilia, the letters, the remaining letters that are there, a public domain biography of her, a whole body of work about Jane Austen. And we steered it towards students and scholars, but also to fan fiction authors, right? Because there's thousands of sequels to Pride and Prejudice that have been written. And so we wanted to create a resource where people could go into the Notebook and say hey, I'm thinking about, I'm not a scholar asking a question about, what was the actual economic context of the exchange between Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet in the scene, but rather I'm thinking about writing a sequel to Pride and Prejudice where Darcy is a vampire. Give me some ideas on how that could go, and Notebook will help you come up with that based on the core text of the original material. And
amazing.
That's it's actually a really fun, delightful use of it that was not in our original plan for the product.
Well, unintended consequences
Exactly.
and uses are always so interesting.
Yep.
But speaking here from the New York Academy of Sciences, I would imagine there would also be robust use cases that are emerging out of the world of scientific research, in which you can take journals that are obviously state of the art in your fields and survey literature and the like. And I know scientists who now are able not only to follow their own fields but adjacent ones that are turning out to be actually. That's the game changer because, I heard an astrophysicist who was reading biology journals and thinking about the way fluids operate and work and move and the like. And he said it was changing his thinking about astrophysics in a way that was never possible before because he couldn't read that literature.
Yeah. It's a great point, Nick. So one of the things that I wrote about a lot in Where Good Ideas Come From and in How We Got to Now, and then we talked about on the show, is when you are asking that question that we talked about earlier about, where do good ideas come from? Like when there are transformative ideas, what are the recurring patterns that we see when we look at the history? And one of them is collisions between different fields. Mm-hmm. So someone is working in one field and looks over at that adjacent field and it's like, hey, there's something interesting there. I wonder if I borrowed that and put it to use here, what would that unlock? And it turns out to change everything. And so that's always been an interest of mine, actually. And you're right, Notebook, in a sense, it's a great translation tool in the sense that it actually, the underlying model speaks 80 plus languages. And so you can load in documents in Portuguese and have a conversation about them in Japanese, and it doesn't matter. But it also works as a kind of professional translation or disciplinary translation tool as well. So it's very good. You could put in you could be, as you say, like a biologist, and you could put in a bunch of works from astrophysics or something like that, and put in like your own thoughts, and then say, is there anything in what I'm working on that relates to the material in this other field based on these documents? Or you can just say, as you said, just translate these into more of a lay common language so that I can understand the core ideas here and see if there's something relevant. And that, we're just getting the beginning of what's possible because of those capabilities. The other thing that's really interesting that I think we've been thinking about from the beginning at NotebookLM that differentiates us from a lot of the other AI apps is we've been thinking about, like, what is the right bundle of knowledge for the age of AI? And so I think, we were thinking about interfaces and, folks like OpenAI were thinking, well, maybe it's like a text chatbot-like interface. It should look like a text chat, and that's a way to visualize these things. But we've been thinking about that, but also, like, how do we organize information given these new tools? And that's where we've increasingly come to believe the structure of the notebook itself, a collection of sources that are organized around a certain theme, is really a kind of a powerful idea. And so we've started publishing in the Featured Notebooks programs these bundles that have been organized by the people at Google Research, which generates lots of interesting scientific and technological papers. And so they've gone through and they've created these collections that have maybe like 12 academic scholarly papers that they've published in various journals, and they're on a team. Each notebook has a kind of overarching research question as its title. And so one of them is like, how can images of the human eye reveal information about our overall health? Which turns out to be a kind of fascinating new set of developments, that AI can see these patterns from retinal scans that humans can't. And it can be like, oh, that person has whatever, this particular illness. So they bundled together all these papers, put them in a notebook, and then they, we published the notebook to the world. Anybody can ask questions. You can go in and say, hey, I'm a 10th grader. I'm interested in this, but please, keep your explanations to a 10th grade level so that I can understand it. Or you can go in and say, hey, I'm an expert in this field, and I want to understand exactly what's happening in these papers at the highest level. And Notebook will just kind of adjust according to that. And it will spin off all these interesting new studio artifacts, as we call them, like audio overviews or slides, our new feature, which is amazing, that translate it into a different mode. So you can visually engage with it. You can listen to it at the gym. You can understand through different modalities like that.
Well, unfortunately, our time is coming to an end, but I just want to, close by noting that you've written about innovation. You've written about how it happens, and we've talked a little bit about it today. But it certainly is advanced by bringing together different perspectives, different disciplines, different ways of thinking about the world, about the problem. And it looks as if NotebookLM is going to be a hugely important tool for advancing the way in which many of us think about fundamental problems, challenges, and questions. And I'd like to invite you back at some point to talk a little bit more about what some of those future challenges, problems, and questions will be, particularly in a world in which AI becomes ever more pervasive.
Yeah.
But we'll probably have to leave that for another session.
I'm ready whenever you want me back.
Terrific.
I'm here, Nick.
Well,
Thank you.
It's been great. But thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us for Shaping Science. It's been great to have you with us.
Thank you.
To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NIAS Sciences.